I think one of the things that really grabbed me about prairies and really pulled me in was the fact that historically and to present day, prairies and human beings have always had a relationship. In fact, I would argue that prairies wouldn't be here if it weren't for human beings to begin with. You know, all the evidence says is that most of the fires that maintain these sites before European settlement were started by Native Americans. What we have today is a situation where if human intervention doesn't occur, if we don't cut trees, if we don't reintroduce sunlight to these sites, if we don't start burning them, what we are going to have is the continual process of forest succession, where canopies go over. These are sun-loving plant communities, and if you don't have sun hitting these plants, the prairie's gone.
Well, this plant in front of us here is a plant called tuberous Indian plantain, but it has these roundish leaves with parallel veins, much like plantains, and they're kind of waxy. It's unusual for a prairie plant to have this waxy, kind of almost plastic-like structure to it, and it was actually got so rare as on our endangered threatened list for a long time, and now has been proposed to come off. Been successful getting it to reproduce in a lot of restorations. Because these ecosystems evolved and developed with fire for thousands of years, we've learned over time for the past 50, 60 years in investigating this that pretty much come to the conclusion that fire is absolutely critical for the maintenance and recovery of these systems. We augment with other management techniques, you know, mowing, cutting, maybe for some very selective grazing, targeted grazing, but for the general health of the system, to increase all this flowering, fire is very important. In fact, fire will increase the flowering of a lot of these plants two to three-fold. After fire, you go a couple years without fire, they stop blooming. You burn, they're all back blooming again.
It's not the trees that we hate, it's the prairie we love. We remove the trees because generally they're not part of the prairie, except for the oak trees, especially bur oak, which has the thick corky bark that survives the prairie fires so well. Mostly, I think the animals that we want to benefit are species that require large, long vistas. They need open grasslands. They're not really made to be happy in close, dense forests.
There was a lot of native plants and forbs and grasses here. If we had been willing to wait indefinitely, they probably would have made a prairie just about like what we have now. But we're too old to wait forever. And so we collected seeds and then overseeded.
Our process for collecting seed is to collect off the remnants. We hand collect as seeds ripen.
So we take all the seed back to the barn and we put it in wading pools so it'll dry out.
Next step is to what we call process or clean the seed, and that is to break up the seed head, to remove the stems, to get the chaff at least small enough that it'll go through our seeder.
And then once it's dry, we put it in bags and we hang the bags up on wires because we don't want the mice and varmints getting at it. And then we mix all the seed together in different proportions for different habitats. So this is a really dry site, so we'd take seeds that are going to do well in dry sites and we'd mix those in one batch, and then we'll take seeds that are good for mesic sites, that are kind of where your corn grows today, and then we mix that into another batch, and then we'll take seeds that are good in really wet sites like we have over at Shea and Mueller on the other side of the hill over there.
Final step is to put it in the fall, and the seed spreader goes on the back end of the tractor. It just spins it out. Some species we have to grow in seed orchards because they're just gone from the landscape.
These are the rare wood lilies. They're in the lower seed orchard of the Mounds grassland area. We're growing them in order to produce seed. And I'm playing part of the insect by deliberately pollinating. There's a bee who's joining me, wants to add in his own pollination, thereby cross-fertilizing and ensuring that as many of these flowers will set seed as possible for the purpose of seed production for us. So never think small of birds and bees. They do this for free all the time.
People love butterflies.
Yeah,
Everybody loves a butterfly, but some people are skittish about bees.
I know bees get a bad rap, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because they have a short period of time to do everything they need to do to reproduce, create the next generation. And the bumblebees overwinter as a queen, and so this big bee emerges as this time of year in the spring, and you know, that's got to start a whole new colony. And so they're really focused on finding those nectar plants, finding the pollen, and they're finely tuned to the variety of plants that are out there. And then the colony dies out during the year. So they got a lot of work to do to build up an entire colony every season. Prairie smoke is a fairly early flower in some of our drier prairies and oak savannas. The prairie smoke blossoms hang downward and they're closed. And the queen needs a good source of protein in the spring. So the bumblebee hangs at the underside of this thing and it buzzes at such a frequency that the pollen is vibrated right out of the anthers and, you know, drops right onto the bumblebee. They're vibrating at what's just about middle C. Wild lupin is another good source of pollen for our wild bees. And it takes a particularly large and strong bee to open these things up. So they push down the lower petal that's known as the keel. This causes the pollen to be ejected onto the bee. And then when that bee leaves to visit another flower, this one remains with the stigma exposed. So when a bee comes to visit it, it can deposit pollen onto the stigma.
Many of our food and forage crops depend on pollinators, and these prairie remnants and prairie areas help support the pollinators.
Yeah, there's more cranberry growers that are making sure there's prairie plants near the cranberry bogs.
Apples, cherries.
Seen that photograph of the people in China hand pollinating the apple trees?
Yeah, I did. Yep.
It's just unbelievable to me. You know, that could happen here.
Yeah, but yeah.
This site has never been plowed. It's a native remnant. It's never been plowed, it's never been grazed. This is exactly the way it looked 150 years ago. We didn't bring in any seed. All we did was clear the trees, clear the brush, and burn it a couple of times. And all of these plants were here, the seed was in the soil, and all it needed was an opportunity to come out. We've got a huge patch of lead plant. We've got tons of rough blazing star, and in the next week or so it'll start to bloom, and it'll just be spectacular out here. My favorite part is how it's changed with our work. When we first came up here, it was completely overgrown with trees, and now you can stand on the bluff and you can watch the eagles, you can watch the turkey vultures, you can watch the herons fly over. I mean, it's a great open space. And across the road, they've been growing corn for the last 50 years. And we worked with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and we had them stop planting the corn. On the other side, we seeded in a lot. When we were out here planting the seed, we saw some herons and of course a pileated woodpecker. And when we burn out here in the spring, there's always a couple of hawks flying around looking for the mice and the gophers.
One of the things that I've learned working with the Prairie Enthusiasts is that we can be active participants in nature. We can go into a site, we can fire up the chainsaw, we can conduct a prescribed burn, and we can watch that system respond to what we're doing, and it can be a two-way street. It can be like a dance. Doing prairie restoration reminds you of that you're part of nature, you're not separate from it.
A lot of the scientific research that the Prairie Enthusiasts are involved in is being used to help with providing more information about restoration and management of these sites. For example, at our preserve not too far from here, the Mounds View grassland, we had an opportunity to take a drained peat wetland about 5 acres. So we took the drain tiles out, we collected vegetation data on the site before we took the drain tiles out, and we scattered seed and we've done some burns, and we've been collecting data every year, quadrat data, to document that conversion, that change from drained peat, pretty much no native stuff left. It was actually in corn at one time. And then with our fires, monitoring some of these rare insects, monitoring the birds and how they're responding to the type of grassland habitat we provide, whether it's brome grass or converting to native prairie. We got projects going on collecting data long term to see how those bird communities are changed or altered to respond to those changes in habitat.
So we're in a bottomland area. This was former cropland. You can see by the rolling hills most of the water would come down here and flow in this broad swath headed toward the stream down that way. So this is rich soil. And this plant, the cup plant, is one of the native plants that would grow in this kind of setting. This can be 6-8 feet high by the end of the summer. Even by the middle of the summer you'll see very high. It'll have a bright yellow sunflower on it. It's got a raspy leaf. Sounds like sandpaper. Big square stem, and the leaves come together in the middle, so they hold, and that's why they call it a cup plant. It has water that settles in there after the rain. Tree frogs love that. If you come back in the late evening, you probably hear tree frogs in this area. They'll be bathing in the cup plant.
I was a forest person coming into these events and just saying, wow, there's all this knowledge that I'm can have access to if I just hang out with these people. And that was one of the selfish reasons I decided to start this chapter. I'm like, I'll get all the prairie people to come to me and I'll learn from them. And I really still feel like a student. There's not a handbook that says this is how you restore a remnant prairie. It's a shared knowledge and we learn as we go. It's about coming together, talking to each other, and sharing our experiences. And that's part of the community aspect of the Prairie Enthusiasts that's so important.
It's really kind of fun, that we got these guys. I'm over 70 years old, and other guys, and we walk to the prairie. All of a sudden, somebody finds some little plant growing, and everybody runs over. It's just like a chicken yard where a chicken finds a worm, and all the rest of the chicken come to it and look at it.
Oh, I think the motive for me and for the interns that work under me is love of the land. People who enjoy outdoor nature. We understand this part of the landscape was a prairie oak savanna fire-dependent ecology, and we feel we are taking care of land. So it's very conscious-driven, driven by an environmental ethic that we have. It's definitely not driven by profit. It's driven by what we feel in our hearts. It is hard to explain to people who don't have that sensation, but it's what we have, and we hope that by providing the landscape for people to come and see, it will inspire many others. And clearly it has, otherwise they would not have contributed all the acres we have and the money the Prairie Enthusiast gets from donors. The people that I work with, they're going to be out in the field every day whether they get paid or not. They dedicate their lives. They retire from their regular job at the IRS, at the auto mechanic, at the bank, and then they become Prairie Enthusiasts for the rest of their lives. This is something apparently so deep in people that they're willing to do that.
Kind of therapeutic. You're outside doing something.
Yeah.
And you get to see and experience all these things that are out on these sites. For me personally, it's just, you give these ecosystems, these plants and insects and things half a chance and you see them coming back. That's what's really rewarding. You throw out the seed, and some of these plantings now are 12 years old and they're starting to look like remnants.
The idea of plants that are still here that Indians had walked on or Indians had used for medicine or for the roots or parts of the plants for food really really amazed me. I guess there was no turning back for me, because as we did more and more prairie burning and brush cutting and finding new species, that was always the neat part.
It is believed that historically, when the bison still were roaming here, that they would use rocks like this one to come and rub when they were changing their fur from one season to another. And you can actually see around the rock when it rains, there's water standing, because all around the rock is like the ground is more compressed, and it's like a little pond with a big rock in the middle of it.
Some people travel the whole world looking for rare animals and rare birds, and here we had the opportunity right in our backyard to find plants that were nearly extinct.
Our native prairie plants historically played a really important role. They're the reason we have the breadbasket of the Midwest, this deep, productive soil. All these fibrous roots. In the prairie, about 60% of the biomass is below ground compared to 40% above ground. All of this root matter underneath is how carbon is fixed into the ground. That's how you get the black soil. And what's happening is that these plants are constantly sloughing off, developing new roots, old roots are dying, and over time that carbon's getting left behind and keeps getting built up. So as these roots die and get replaced, they leave behind little channels when that root system dies out that end up as being channels for water to percolate down through. And they've found with studies that they've done that original prairie sod can mostly eliminate surface water runoff, whereas Kentucky bluegrass lawn is very shallow rooted and it's dense, that a lot of the rain ends up running off. And that happens in croplands as well. You just don't have the air spaces and those channels for that water to get taken down into the groundwater table.
I just think oak savannas are like one of the just most gorgeous ecosystems that are out there, and it used to be really common in this state, and now you just really almost never see them anymore, and it's just a real shame just from fire mismanagement. So any part that I can have to like make the remnants either better or even like bring back.
And on a daily basis, I really like seeing all of the rare plants and birds that are on the Prairie Enthusiast lands. But probably my favorite thing that we've done so far is we hand pollinated the wood lilies at Mounds View. And there are so few of them, they don't want to leave it up to chance.
I love working here because mostly the scenery, it's all the different sights, sounds, smells of the different flowers and the birds in the background and all that is just soothing. It's hard work, but it's very worthwhile.
It's also really nice being able to make a change on the environment you're working on and really see that you're making a positive difference for conservation.
I have 4 grandchildren, and when I take them into the woods or prairie, first I have to disarm them from all the technology. And when they were little, I used to take them for listening walks at night. They would all hold their rope and have a flashlight, and we walk through the woods and just listen to leaves and grasses and stuff. But that is so eaten up by technology that it's just, I'm sure in their psychic, they might have to go to 5-year psychoanalysis before they would discover they ever experienced that. You know, only man in his linear thinking always creates a simple environment.
Prairies are endless grasslands, and we don't have that. What we've got is prairie remnants. And that's really the best terminology, because we just have bits and pieces of the ecosystem.
Like all prairies, remnants are basically in the poorest possible soil conditions that have survived. Railroad tracks, old abandoned cemeteries, and land that couldn't be plowed. And I know we need corn and beans and so forth, but southern Minnesota has become a bit of a green desert, really.
Just think of yourself as a monarch butterfly being hatched in Canada and on your migrational trip to Mexico for the winter. Think about flying over Iowa, that's corn from the northern border almost to the southern border, flying over Illinois, which is 90% corn, flying over Oklahoma and Kansas, which is all in agriculture. It amazes me that they can find enough food to even make that trip. I don't even have any idea what they'd be nectaring on.
You know, a monarch would have to pack a lunch to get across this area. So it's good to have these little islands of seed beds that we can collect seed and spread out to other areas.
Even these small patches of 5 or 6 acres that I've got here that's in prairie grasses and forbs seems to be vital to a lot of species. It seems to be a wayside where they can rest.
To take a cornfield and restore it back to prairie or savanna, probably we're talking more like a century or two before you're going to get back a composition of insects and soil organisms and plants that really equal what the remnants were like. The Prairie Enthusiasts has a 3-part mission, the primary one being protection. We have conservation easements. That's one tool where the landowner retains title and there's just an enforcement to keep it as a conservation land. And that's good. It works for a lot of situations, but it's not as secure as having title. When the conservation group actually has title to the land, we aren't in a position of, in perpetuity trying to defend this easement. The Sugar River Savanna Preserve here is an example of a restoration recovery of a site that's getting really close to a remnant. My wife and I ended up doing a bargain sale to the Prairie Enthusiasts to have permanent protection done on the site. Starting in the 30s, my family started farming just north of here. And in this picture, you can see in 77, that bottomland was basically solid re-canary grass. And with these pictures you can now see today of the site, you can see where we've been able to push the re-canary grass back with frequent burning and reintroducing things like Joe Pye weed and wild sunflowers and things like that. Over 38 years now, we've kind of brought the site back to something close to the original oak savanna. 270 or so species survived on site. With the fires and bringing in more seed, we've increased that and brought in another 130 or so species. It is a restoration, but it also is a remnant to some degree. It's kind of a hybrid situation.
Finally, it reached the point when I understood that by doing prairie conservation and preaching about its values, that I was putting back. I was giving back in some way that was important for me and leaving a trace of myself here. This pod right here is purple milkweed. You can see I've written on there. It's the only one I could find this year. Here's the seed inside here. And the seed is pretty ripe. The purple milkweed is listed as an endangered species in Wisconsin. Well, our savannas have closed in, become more brushy and more dense with smaller trees. So the only habitat left suitable for purple milkweeds is on roadsides.
When we first did some initial clearing, all of a sudden we had this very attractive plant called purple milkweed, which popped up, and we didn't know what it was. It turned out to be an endangered species in Wisconsin. Its habitat is savanna, and we were creating the habitat for it, but the plant had been there. And as we have cleared more and more land, we've had more and more purple milkweeds pop up. What they needed was a little more light and fire, which would eliminate a lot of the competitors, and then they came up.
I would say that the day that we had the weed, trees, and underbrush and junk out of here so that it was an open savanna, about that day we saw a red-headed woodpecker, which we'd never seen before here or for me anywhere. They're savanna specialists. They prefer savannas and are rarely found anywhere else. And now they're quite rare because savannas are very rare. We have quite a few here now, and that's very rewarding. We get excited every time we see one. The rewards are slow in coming sometimes. I like to say that you have to live a very long time to be a restoration worker because the rewards are rather slow over the years. But it's in pretty good shape now, There's always more to do, and it's just so beautiful.
I think what's important on these prairies, people seem to recognize the importance of saving grassland habitat for birds. And they certainly admire the flowers and the butterflies, but most people don't understand how essential the prairies are for napping. You really can't take a good nap unless it's quiet and peaceful. So prairies are ideal.